My name is Eleanor, though in my younger days friends used to call me Ellie, and now in my old age most people who still remember me call me Grandma Eleanor. But lately even that feels like a name whispered into the wind with no one really listening. I was born and raised here in California, where the sun seems to shine endlessly, where the sea air mixes with the scent of orange blossoms, and where beauty fills the outside world even when the inside of a person feels empty. My life was never grand or rich, but it was full in its own way, full of the sounds of children's feet running down the hall, the warmth of bread baking in the oven, and the joy of hearing voices calling out, "Mom," or "Grandma," in the rooms I worked so hard to keep warm and welcoming. My husband and I built our home here, not big, not fancy, but a home that held laughter, quarrels, Sunday dinners, and the kind of small memories that weave together a whole life. I used to believe those days of noise and togetherness would never end, that I would always have someone coming through the door, asking me what was for dinner, or leaning on me to tell me their troubles. But life has a way of slipping out from under you, not all at once, but slowly, so slowly you hardly notice until the silence around you feels heavier than the walls themselves. My children grew as children do. They went away to schools, to marriages, to jobs, and I told myself that was the way it was supposed to be, that every mother raises her children to spread their wings, and I did feel proud for a time when they would still come back, bringing friends, filling the table with chatter, laughter, and stories. I remember standing in the doorway sometimes, watching them laugh together, thinking to myself, this is what family means. But as the years passed, those visits grew fewer, the phone calls shorter, and little by little I realized I was holding on to memories more than moments. What hurts the most isn't just the quiet of my house, it's the sound of theirs, because I live close enough to hear when they gather. I hear the barbecues, the birthday songs, the clinking of glasses, the bursts of laughter carried over the evening air, and I sit on my porch in my old rocking chair, the one that once belonged to my mother, listening to the joy that I used to be part of. At first, I told myself not to think too much of it. Maybe they forgot. Maybe it was just a small gathering. Maybe they didn't want to trouble me. I even tried to smile, telling myself that at least they were happy together, that my children still had each other, and that should be enough. But deep inside, as I sipped my tea and rocked quietly, I couldn't ignore the sting of hearing them laugh without me. I remember one evening especially. It was my grandson's birthday, and I had baked a cake earlier in the day, certain they would stop by or call for me to join. But as the lights went on across the street, I saw balloons tied to their mailbox and heard children's voices singing happy birthday. I stood at my window with my cake sitting untouched behind me, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. The laughter grew louder, music spilled out, and yet my house remained silent. By the time the night ended, I sat alone with tears in my eyes, realizing the truth I had tried so hard to push away. They were laughing, but they were laughing without me. And the question that haunted me most was why. I spent the days after that birthday trying to convince myself not to be hurt, telling myself over and over that maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe they thought I was busy. Maybe they believed I would not want to sit among the noise and chaos the way I used to when I was younger. But deep inside I knew that was not true, because no matter how old I get, I have always found joy in the noise of family, in the clatter of dishes, in the squeals of children running around the living room, in the way laughter fills a house until even the walls seem to glow. But for some reason they had decided I was no longer meant to be part of that glow. I tried calling my daughter the next day, my voice trembling just a little as I asked how the birthday had gone. And she said, "Oh, it was lovely. The children had so much fun." And she went on to describe the decorations and the games and the cake, never once realizing I was sitting there on the other end of the line staring at the cake I had baked, untouched and stale now. wondering why she had not thought to invite me to share in those moments. I wanted so badly to say, "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you want me there?" But the words stuck in my throat because I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to make her feel guilty, and so instead I just listened quietly, murmuring, "That sounds wonderful," even as my heart ached. Later that week I saw them again, not at my house, but gathered outside laughing as they loaded up the car for some outing, the children excitedly running around with their little backpacks. And again, I was not part of it. I stood behind my curtains, watching them from my window, feeling like a stranger in my own family's world, someone who had been written out of the script without even knowing it. The strange thing is that I was not always on the outside like this. There were years when I was the center of everything, the one who planned the birthdays, who cooked the holiday dinners, who decorated the tree at Christmas, who stayed up late sewing costumes for school plays, and back then no one could take a step without calling out Mom or Grandma. I gave my whole self to them, and I never thought twice about it, because that is what mothers and grandmothers do. We give, we sacrifice, we carry the burdens quietly so our children can live lighter. But now I find myself wondering if in giving so much of myself, I somehow made it too easy for them to take me for granted, to assume I would always be there, quietly sitting in the background, not needing an invitation, not needing a seat at the table. Still, I kept telling myself maybe the next time would be different. Maybe the next gathering would include me. And then it came, another evening, another burst of laughter from across the way, another night of music and clinking glasses. I stepped outside on my porch that night, the cool California air brushing against my face, and I listened. I listened to their voices rise and fall, to the familiar sounds of stories being told, to the laughter that came in waves, and I closed my eyes, almost pretending I was there among them, almost fooling myself into thinking that at any moment someone would call out my name. "Grandma Eleanor, come sit with us," but no voice came, only more laughter without me. That was the night I realized how sharp loneliness can feel, not just the quiet kind when you are sitting alone in a room, but the sharper kind, when you are surrounded by life and joy yet cut off from it, when you are close enough to hear the laughter, but not close enough to be part of it. I went inside and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the old photo albums stacked neatly in the corner, albums full of birthdays and gatherings where I had once been included, where I was the one smiling with a child on my lap or standing proudly by a cake. I opened one and ran my fingers over the pictures, wondering how time had shifted things so much that now I was just the forgotten figure sitting in the dark. I wondered if they even noticed, if they even realized that I was sitting there across the way, listening, aching, waiting for them to remember me. I told myself maybe it was my fault. Maybe I had not spoken up enough. Maybe I had not reminded them that I wanted to be there. But then I thought, should a mother, should a grandmother, really have to beg to be included in her own family's joy? The thought settled heavy in me, and for the first time in many years, I felt truly invisible. And yet, despite the ache, despite the tears that came that night, I knew in my heart that I still loved them with everything in me. Because love does not disappear, even when it hurts. It lingers, it waits, it hopes. And so I sat quietly at my table, whispering a prayer that maybe one day they would see me again, not as a shadow on the porch, not as someone left behind, but as the Eleanor who gave them life, who held their hands when they were small, who laughed with them once, before they learned how to laugh without me. The days kept passing, and with every gathering I heard without being invited, I felt myself shrinking a little more, as if each laugh that floated across the air was chipping away at me bit by bit, leaving me smaller, quieter, almost invisible, and I wondered how it had come to this, how a woman who once held her family together had now become the forgotten piece sitting in silence. I tried to busy myself with little things around the house, watering my plants, knitting scarves no one asked for, baking pies that never left the counter, because part of me thought maybe if I kept doing the things I always did, somehow they would remember. Somehow they would say, "Grandma makes the best pie. Let's go see her." But the knock on the door never came. Sometimes I thought about walking across the street myself, knocking on their door with a smile, pretending I just happened to be passing by. But then I would stop, afraid of what I might see in their eyes, afraid that my presence might feel like an intrusion rather than a welcome. And that fear kept me rooted to my own porch, rocking back and forth, listening but never joining. One evening, as the sun was setting, I heard them again, the sound of guitars strumming and voices singing, and it brought back memories of when we used to sit together as a family. My husband with his old guitar, the children singing along even if they were off-key, the whole room filled with warmth. I closed my eyes and I could almost feel those days again. But when I opened them, the only thing in front of me was the fading light of the sky and the sound of music coming from a house that was not mine. That night I cried not loud sobs, but quiet tears that slid down my cheeks as I whispered to myself, "Why not me? Why not anymore?" It is a strange kind of grief, grieving for people who are still alive, grieving for a family that is still there but no longer holding you close. In those moments, I thought back to my own mother, how I used to call her often, how I made sure she came to every gathering, and I asked myself if maybe I had failed to teach my own children the same. I remembered her face at my table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes glowing as she watched her grandchildren run around. And I thought about how important she was to me, how I never once thought to leave her behind, and I could not understand why my children had chosen differently with me. But still, even with all the sadness, I loved them, and I could not let go of that love because it was stronger than the loneliness. One morning, I decided I would try again to reach out. I called my son and asked if I could stop by, and he sounded surprised, almost as if the idea of me coming over was unusual, but he said yes, so I baked a pie, carried it carefully in my arms, and walked over. When I stepped inside, the house was full of toys scattered across the floor, laughter bouncing from the walls, and for a moment, my heart swelled just being in it again. The children ran to me, hugging me, their little arms wrapping around my waist, and I thought maybe, just maybe, things would be different now. But as I stood there, I noticed something. My son and his wife exchanged a glance, the kind of glance that says something unspoken, something not meant for me to see, and I felt again that I was an outsider looking in. They were polite, they offered me tea, they thanked me for the pie, but it was not the same as before, not the same as when I was a part of it naturally, when my place was secure without needing an invitation. I sat with them for a while, laughed when the children said funny things, nodded as they told me about work and plans, but inside I felt a hollow space that no tea or pie could fill. When I walked back to my own house that afternoon, the sun was warm on my shoulders, yet I felt a chill inside, as though no matter how much light shone around me, I would always be sitting in the shadows of my own family's life. That evening, I sat at my table again, my photo albums open, and I told myself I had to accept it, that maybe this was simply the way life goes, that children grow and families shift, that mothers and grandmothers must learn to step back. But acceptance is not easy when your heart still aches, when your ears still hear the laughter across the way, when your soul still longs to sit among them. I told myself I must find strength, that I could not let the loneliness break me, because if I let it, then I would lose everything that still keeps me standing. So I whispered to myself, "Eleanor, you are still here, you still matter," even if I was the only one who seemed to believe it. And in that quiet moment, I made a promise to myself. I would not stop loving them, but I would also find ways to love myself again, to find meaning in the days, even if they were filled with silence, because I could not let my life be measured only by the laughter I was not invited to share. After that day when I promised myself to find strength, I began to look at my life differently, not because the pain had gone away, but because I realized I could not sit forever by the window waiting for something that might never come. It is a strange thing growing old, because your body slows, your hair turns white, your hands wrinkle, yet inside you still feel like the same person who once ran barefoot across the grass, who once held dreams larger than life itself. And that part of me, the young girl who lived inside, whispered to me that I was not finished yet, that I still had days ahead of me to fill with meaning, even if my family no longer made me the center of theirs. So I started small. I began taking walks around the neighborhood in the early mornings when the streets were quiet, and I noticed things I had overlooked before. The way the roses bloomed along the fence of Mrs. Ramirez's house, the sound of birds gathering in the trees, the cool mist that hung low before the sun rose high. These little things became my companions, my reminders that the world was still alive, and so was I. On one of those walks, I stopped at the small park near the school, and I watched the children run across the playground, their laughter carrying through the air in the same way my grandchildren's laughter once filled my home. At first it stung, but then I smiled, because laughter, no matter where it comes from, still has the power to warm heart. I started bringing breadcrumbs to feed the ducks at the pond, and before long I found myself exchanging smiles and greetings with other people who came to the park, older folks like me, people who carried their own stories of being forgotten or left behind, though we didn't need to say it aloud. It was enough to sit on a bench, nod at one another, and feel seen, even by strangers. One day, a woman named Clara, who was about my age, sat beside me with her knitting, and we struck up a conversation. She told me about her children, how they had all moved far away, how the house was too quiet now, and I told her a little of my own story, though I left out the part about hearing my family laugh without me, because even though it was true, it felt too heavy to say out loud. Still, there was comfort in sharing a moment with someone who understood. We began to meet at the park more often, bringing our knitting, our books, and sometimes just ourselves. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if it was just on a simple wooden bench beside the pond. Yet, even with these small joys, the ache inside me never fully left. Each time I walked past my children's house and saw the lights glowing, heard the laughter and chatter, I felt that sting again, that reminder that I was near but not included. One night it grew especially strong. I heard them gathered outside, the smell of barbecue drifting into my yard, the sound of clinking glasses, and I could even hear my daughter's voice telling a story that I recognized because it was one I had told her as a child. For a moment, I almost laughed with them, but then the tears came because I realized they were sharing my stories without me, holding my memories while leaving me behind. That was when I sat myself down in my rocking chair, the one that belonged to my mother, and I thought about what she would tell me if she were still here. She was a strong woman, my mother, someone who endured hardships with grace, and I imagined her voice saying, "Eleanor, you cannot change what others choose, but you can choose what you do with your own days." So I began to write. I pulled out an old notebook and started jotting down my memories. Stories of my childhood in California. Stories of raising my children. Stories of love and loss, and even stories of loneliness. At first it was just scribbles, thoughts I needed to put somewhere. But as the pages filled, I realized I was leaving behind something important, something that would speak even if I could not. And though my family might not sit with me now, I hoped one day they might read my words and remember who I was, not just the woman left sitting alone, but the mother and grandmother who loved them with every piece of her being. Writing gave me strength, it gave me purpose, and slowly I began to feel less invisible. The laughter across the street still hurt, but it no longer defined me because I had found a voice in my notebook, a way to be part of something again, even if it was only my own story. And in that quiet act, I began to reclaim pieces of myself that I thought I had lost. The more I wrote in that notebook, the more I realized how much I had been holding inside me all these years, how many memories I had tucked away like folded linens in a drawer, neat and silent, but still carrying the scent of the life I once lived. I wrote about my first day of school in a small California classroom with wooden desks that squeaked when we shifted in them. About the time my father bought me a blue ribbon for my hair that made me feel like the most important little girl in the world. About meeting my husband at the town dance, where he was so nervous he stepped on my toes, but still managed to make me laugh. And about the way I felt the first time I held each of my children in my arms, how the world seemed to pause in that instant, as if heaven itself had whispered that I had been chosen for something sacred. Writing those stories made me feel alive again, because they reminded me that I had not simply been forgotten furniture in the corner. I had lived, I had loved, I had mattered. And yet, even as I found comfort in those words, the ache returned each time I heard the laughter across the street. One evening, it was especially hard. They had gathered for what seemed like a big celebration. Voices spilling out into the night, music drifting in waves, and the sound of children squealing with delight. I sat on my porch with my notebook in my lap, pen resting between my fingers, and for a moment I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me. I tried to pretend I was part of it, tried to imagine myself sitting at their table, listening to the same stories, sharing the same food, laughing along. But no matter how hard I tried, the truth sat heavy on my chest. I was not there. I was close enough to hear them, but too far to touch, like watching life through a window you cannot open. I wrote down in my notebook that night, "The cruelest sound is laughter you cannot share." When I read those words back to myself, tears blurred the ink, but I also felt a strange strength, because even if they had left me out, I still had my voice, I still had my way of speaking, even if it was only to myself. In the days that followed, I grew bolder. I decided to join a small community group at the church, something I had once done years ago, but let go of when I became too busy with children and housework. Walking into that room filled with other older folks was frightening at first, because I felt rusty at conversation, unsure if I even knew how to be part of something anymore. But then a woman smiled at me and a man offered me a chair, and before long I found myself knitting beside them, sipping tea and listening to their stories. Many of them spoke of the same kind of loneliness, of children who had moved away, of grandchildren who barely knew their names. And suddenly I realized I was not alone in my pain. We laughed together at our own small jokes, we shared recipes, and sometimes we even sang old hymns off-key, but with so much heart it didn't matter. It wasn't the same as being with my family, but it was something that reminded me I still had worth. Still, despite these new connections, I could not silence the longing for my own children. One afternoon, I saw my daughter outside watering her flowers, and I gathered the courage to walk across the street. My hands trembled as I approached, but I smiled and said hello, and for a moment it felt almost normal, like when she was younger and used to follow me into the garden asking questions about everything. I told her I missed her, and she looked at me with surprise, as if the thought had never crossed her mind that I could feel left out. She said, "Oh, Mom, we didn't want to bother you. We thought you'd be tired with all the noise." And I just nodded, because what else could I do? But inside my heart cried out, because I wasn't tired, I wasn't too old for noise. I was only tired of silence. That night I wrote again in my notebook. They think I want quiet, but quiet is the heaviest burden. I closed the book and held it to my chest, whispering to myself that I still had hope, that maybe someday they would see me not as someone too fragile for their joy, but as someone still hungry for it, still alive enough to need it. Until then, I told myself I would keep walking, keep writing, keep seeking pieces of life wherever I could find them. Because if I stopped, if I let the loneliness win, then I truly would become invisible. And I refused to disappear, not yet, not while my heart still beat with love for them. Even if that love was met with laughter I could only hear from afar. The days kept rolling forward, each one blending into the next, and though I tried to fill them with my walks, my writing, and the company of new acquaintances, the truth is that the ache inside of me never truly left, for there was no replacing the sound of my own children's voices directed toward me, no replacing the weight of a grandchild climbing into my lap just because they wanted to be near me, no replacing the warmth of being part of a family's laughter rather than listening to it, through walls and windows. It was strange, really, because the older I grew, the more I realized how time itself had become slippery, rushing by in waves I could hardly keep hold of, and I knew deep in my bones that I had fewer days ahead of me than behind me, which made the loneliness even sharper, because I did not want to spend these last years as a shadow, unseen by the very people I had poured my life into. There were nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the memories of my younger days flickering across my mind like old home movies, and I could hear my own laughter mingling with the voices of my children when they were small, and I wondered when, exactly, I had gone from the center of their world to the edge of it. Sometimes I thought about my husband, how he had been my anchor through so much, and I wished with all my heart he was still here, because if he were, I would not be so alone. I would have someone to lean against, someone to share the silence with, and perhaps he would know what to say to the children, how to remind them that I still mattered. Without him, I felt smaller, weaker, and though I tried not to let it show, there were days when even getting out of bed seemed too heavy a task. Still, I forced myself, because something inside me refused to give up. I kept telling myself that love was stronger than loneliness, and even if they could not see me, I would not stop loving them, because that was what it meant to be a mother, to keep giving even when nothing was given back. One Sunday afternoon, I heard the laughter again, louder this time, and when I peeked through my curtains I saw the whole family gathered in the yard across the way, a barbecue sizzling, children running around with balloons, and I realized it must have been another birthday, or perhaps an anniversary, some special occasion that brought them all together. For a long moment I stood there frozen, my hands pressed against the glass, wanting so badly to step outside and walk over, to say, "Hello, I am here, let me be part of this." But my feet would not move, because the fear of rejection was stronger than my longing. Instead, I sat back down in my rocking chair, listening to the sound of their joy, tears slipping down my cheeks, and I whispered to myself, "You are still their mother, you are still their grandmother, even if they do not call you." Later that evening, when the party had ended and the lights in their house dimmed, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote in my notebook again, pouring every thought and ache onto the page, and I realized as I wrote that I was not just leaving behind a story for them, but for myself, a reminder that I had lived a life filled with love, even if it was no longer returned to me in the way I longed for. The next morning, I decided I needed to be braver. I dressed carefully, combed my white hair, and walked to the local library where they sometimes held readings and community events. I had not been inside for many years, not since my children were little and I used to take them there to pick out books. But as I stepped through the doors, the scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around me like an old friend. There was a small group gathered, seniors mostly, reading aloud stories and poems they had written, and my heart skipped a beat when I thought of the notebook sitting back at home, filled with my own words. I sat quietly that first time, listening as people shared, their voices trembling but proud, and I felt something stir in me. By the end of the session, One of the women asked if I might come back next week and bring something to read. And though my instinct was to shy away, to say no, I found myself nodding. That night, I sat with my notebook and chose one of the softer entries, a story about the time my children and I had taken a picnic to the beach, how the wind had tangled our hair and the seagulls had stolen bits of bread, how we had laughed until our stomachs hurt, and I practiced reading it aloud until my voice felt steady. When the next week came, I stood before that small circle of people and I read my story, my hand shaking, my voice trembling at first, but then stronger as I felt their eyes on me, not with pity, but with warmth. When I finished, they clapped, and one man even said, "That reminded me of my own family." And in that moment, I realized that even if my children had forgotten me, my words still had the power to touch someone. It was not the same as sitting among my family's laughter, but it was something real, something that filled a hollow place inside me, if only for a little while. After that, I began to go every week, sometimes reading, sometimes just listening, and slowly I began to feel part of a community again. And yet, each night when I returned home, the silence of my house pressed against me, and each time I heard laughter from across the street, the ache returned, sharp and deep. One evening, after such a gathering, I sat alone and whispered to myself, maybe one day they will understand. Maybe one day they will remember I am still here. And though the tears came, I also felt a spark inside me that had not been there for a long time. A spark that told me I was not finished yet, that my story was not just about being left behind, but about finding a way to rise even in the loneliest of nights. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it, and though I had spent so many nights crying softly to myself, listening to the laughter that floated across the air without me, I did not know that my story was still waiting for its turn to change, that the silence which had weighed so heavily on me would one day open into something brighter. It began on an ordinary afternoon when I was at the library again, sharing one of my stories about the children when they were little, and a kind woman who worked there approached me afterward and said, "Eleanor, you should share these with your family. They are beautiful." I smiled politely, but inside I felt the old ache, thinking, my family doesn't want to hear my stories anymore. Still, her words stayed with me, and later that night I copied one of the entries neatly onto a piece of paper, folded it carefully, and left it on my daughter's porch with a small note that said, "A memory for you." I did not know if she would read it or throw it away, but somehow I felt lighter having left a piece of myself behind. A few days later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, my daughter stood there holding the paper in her hand, her eyes wet, and she whispered, "Mom, I didn't know you remembered all that." I told her, of course, I remembered, that those moments were the brightest lights in my life, and for the first time in a long time, she hugged me tightly, almost like the little girl she once was. That hug felt like sunlight breaking through after a long winter. From that moment, things did not change overnight, but slowly, gently, doors began to open again. My daughter asked if she could hear more, so I read to her from my notebook one afternoon, and the children listened too, wide-eyed at the thought of their mother as a little girl running through California orchards, chasing butterflies. My grandson climbed onto my lap as I spoke, and in that moment I felt the years fall away, and I knew I still had a place in their lives. Not long after, my son came by with his family, and though he had been more distant, he too asked to read some of the stories, and I could see in his eyes a kind of realization, as if he finally understood that I was not just the quiet old woman across the street, but the foundation of the laughter they now shared. The turning point came one evening when I heard music and laughter again drifting across the way. But this time, there was a knock on my door. My granddaughter stood there, smiling shyly, and she said, "Grandma Eleanor, come on. Everyone's waiting for you." For a moment, I could hardly breathe, as if my heart had forgotten how to carry so much joy at once. But I took her hand and walked across the street. When I stepped into their yard, the lights twinkling above, the smell of food in the air, and the sound of laughter surrounding me, I felt tears welling in my eyes. But this time they were not from sadness. My daughter placed a chair right in the center, and my son raised a glass, saying, "To Mom, who taught us how to laugh in the first place." The children crowded around me, asking me to tell a story, and as I began to speak, their laughter rose again. But now I was inside of it, wrapped in it, part of it once more. That night, I realized something important. Sometimes people forget not because they do not love you, but because life rushes so quickly they fail to see what is slipping away. But love, when reminded gently, has the power to return, to heal, to restore. Sitting there surrounded by my family's joy, I no longer felt invisible. I felt seen, heard, cherished. Later, as the party wound down and the children drifted off to sleep, my daughter squeezed my hand and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. We should never have left you out." I told her I forgave her, because holding on to anger would only steal the joy of the moment, and instead I chose to hold on to the love that had found its way back to me. That night, when I returned to my little house, I sat in my rocking chair under the quiet stars, and for the first time in many years, I did not feel alone. The laughter still echoed in my ears, but now it was mine too, and I whispered a thank you to God for giving me the strength to endure until this moment came. I opened my notebook once more, and on a fresh page I wrote, "Today they laughed with me." And I knew, no matter how many days I had left, that memory would carry me through, a gentle reminder that love is never truly lost, only waiting to be found again.